For one of my first videos covering a more modern ship, we looked at the Indian aircraft carrier Vikramaditya, a ship that began her life as the Soviet aircraft carrier or heavy aviation cruiser Baku, the last of the class, and a ship that was heavily modernized into a proper carrier for the Indian Navy. A second life that is, arguably, much better than her first. The reason I bring this up is because today's video will be covering one of her sister ships, in the form of Minsk, a ship with a far less successful second life, where Baku would end up converted into a proper, if admittedly small, carrier. Minsk was sold to China, where she ended up as a theme park attraction of all things. The same thing happened to the name ship Kiev, but at least that ship was treated better. Minsk, not so much. She hasn't had a good time in China, even ignoring the recent fire. This on top of leaving service early due to a lack of refit. Still, despite her later life, Minsk did what the Soviets needed her to do. As such, let's look at the design of the ship first, and then move on to her service. Now, the first thing to remember about the Kievs is that these ships were fundamentally a multi-role design. Their designation of heavy aviation cruiser is fitting here. Now, admittedly, that was a political move. Treaty restrictions prohibited aircraft carriers above 15,000 tons from passing through the Bosporus. So, in order to get around that, the Soviets would call the ships heavy aviation cruisers. That is the legal fiction. In practical terms, however, the designation does actually fit. Certainly more than it fits the later Kuznetsov. The Kievs were as much missile cruiser as aircraft carrier. And depending on who you ask, they might be considered more missile cruiser than carrier. This is quite clear when you look at the ship and her weaponry, namely the bow. Minsk had 4 twin launchers for the P-500 Basalt surface-to-surface missile system, for 8 missiles in all, or to use the NATO codename, the SSN-12 Sandbox. Not quite as powerful as the P-700 Granite on the Kirov, but still a very potent weapon. A 550-kilometer, 342-mile range with a 950-kilogram, 2,094-pound warhead. These weapons were arguably the main striking power of the Kiev-class ships, as we'll see when we look to the air wing. But first, the rest of the ship's weaponry. While the Sandbox missiles were certainly the main focus, the ship also had an extensive surface-to-air missile battery, 2 twin launchers for the M11 Storm missile, NATO codename SAN-3 Goblet, with 4 launchers in all. Unlike the big anti-ship missiles, Minsk carried 72 of those missiles, plenty of reloads should it be necessary. The same applies to the 2 Mk-33 OSA-M launchers, with 40 missiles in all. NATO codenamed those the SSN-4 Gecko, with these admittedly better recognized for their land-based version, which is about as classic Soviet SAM launcher as it gets without being the SA-2 of Vietnam War fame. The weaponry after the missiles, meanwhile, was rounded off by 2 twin AK-726 76mm guns alongside 8 30mm AK-630 close-in weapons. One of the 76mm guns was carried between the anti-ship missile tubes, while the other was aft of the island. The 30mm guns, meanwhile, were spread around the ship, in addition to 10 533mm torpedo tubes, mostly for anti-submarine warfare, with a similar role assigned to the single twin rocket launcher which could be equipped with nuclear-tipped rockets, if you really wanted to ruin a submarine's day, along with the local sea life. Never let it be said that the Soviets weren't concerned by the threat of Western submarines. You'll also see differing reports on if the ship had two RBU-6000 anti-submarine rocket launchers or not. Baku certainly did, but the older ships are typically cited as not having them. In any case, though, that wraps up the weaponry. All of this added up to a ship displacing around 30,500 tons standard and 41,400 tons at the full loading, on a length of 273 meters, 896 feet, and a beam of 49 meters, or 161 feet, with the flight deck canted out to the side, coming in at 189 meters, 620 feet long, and 20.7 meters, 68 feet wide. Serviced by two elevators, one for the fighter aircraft and one for the helicopters. Befitting both an aircraft carrier, if an odd one, and a ship of the late Cold War, there's no armor protection to note. So that just leaves the speed and the air wing to round off the ship's design. The speed came out to 32 knots on 140,000 shaft horsepower. In this case by conventional steam turbines, as these ships were not nuclear powered. As for the air wing, that was fairly small. It also varied on time period, which ship you were looking at, and what mission the ship was on. For example, Minsk commissioned with 14 Yak-38 vertical takeoff and landing fighters, as well as 20 Ka-25 helicopters split between 3 different roles. The majority of them, 16 in this case, were multi-role models, while 2 were specifically for anti-submarine warfare, and the final 2 were search and rescue helicopters. You could also see a couple of the helicopters deleted to carry up to 16 of the Yak fighters. Now, those aircraft would be why I mentioned before that the main striking power was arguably the missiles. This wasn't a bad aircraft necessarily, but it also wasn't very capable in the attack role. The Yak-38 was small with stubby wings. This meant the plane could only carry 2 500-kilogram bombs, or alternatively, 4 250-kilogram weapons. 1,100 pounds or 551 pounds respectively. Alternatively, 2 air-to-air or 2 air-to-surface missiles. The aircraft was also relatively slow at 1,050 kilometers per hour, or 650 miles per hour. Apparently, they weren't very good turn fighters either, and there was also a bit of a bad habit of the planes crashing. I've seen one source note 41 out of 231 aircraft lost to accidents. So, while the Yak-38 was a functional aircraft, you can probably see why the missiles were the real striking power. The fighters were more for fleet defense in the end. Regardless, that wraps up the design history. Now we can talk the service. I should note, in common with other Cold War Soviet ships, there's not a lot to go off of here. Her service isn't well recorded in English sources. I've dug around as best I can, but there are limits to what I could find. So, with that in mind, the ship that would become Minsk was laid down in what was then shipyard number 444 in Nikolaev on the Black Sea coast of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Nowadays, that would be Mykolaiv in modern Ukraine. This came on December 28, 1972, with the ship launched on September 30th, 1975, and then commissioned almost exactly 3 years later on September 27th of 1978. Her time in the Black Sea after this would be fairly limited. Minsk was assigned to the Soviet Pacific Fleet in late 1978, with the carrier departing in February 1979. This would see the ship leave Sevastopol, sail through the Bosporus, and into the Mediterranean, where she would briefly meet up with her sister ship Kiev, the first time the Soviets had two aircraft carriers operate together. Even if it was short-lived, as Minsk continued on, she would sail around Africa before moving to Vladivostok, arriving there in July 1979. This would remain her base for much of the ship's service history, with her time in the Pacific largely spent on patrol and showing the flag. While the Soviets were fighting in Afghanistan in the 1980s, that didn't exactly involve the Soviet Navy. Instead, Minsk would occupy her time visiting various ports. For example, Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam in September 1980, a reassurance visit in the aftermath of the Sino-Vietnamese War in 1979. This was her first major foreign mission, although it was, again, fairly short-lived. Minsk would be back in Vladivostok by October 1980 for a 2-year refit that concluded in August 1982. Now, before I touch on her service after that refit, there's one note to make. A Soviet cosmonaut had 2 accidents aboard Minsk while flying Yak-38s. The first was in December 1979. He survived this by ejecting on December 27th. Unfortunately, another accident would follow on September 8, 1980, while taking off in the South China Sea. He would not survive that one. The cosmonaut lost his life taking off from Minsk. However, with that unfortunate incident covered, it's time to go back to the ship. When her refit concluded, Minsk returned to Vietnam before sailing on to India. While in India, Minsk would make demonstration flights of her aircraft, before moving on to visit other ports in 1983. After this, what the ship was up to for the rest of her service isn't entirely clear. I've seen reference to the ship joining an amphibious operation training in Vietnam during 1984, as well as joint operations with the Vietnamese in March and April of 1986. But how accurate this is not entirely clear. On the other hand, her visit to Wonsan in North Korea in July 1986 seems to be better sourced. Unfortunately, it's also the last event in her active service I could find any reference to. Either way, what is apparent is that by the 1990s, the ship was in drastic need of an overhaul, a proper refit. I've also seen reference to flooding damage in her bow during 1990, but again take that with a grain of salt. Regardless, by 1991, the ship was due for a refit period in her construction yard in Ukraine. However, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the sticky political mess that resulted, this wasn't feasible. Minsk was put into reserve instead, with the ship decommissioned in 1993, with the disarmed hulk sold for scrap in South Korea in 1994 or 1995, depending on the source. In the end, however, the ship would instead be sold on to a Chinese scrapyard at first. Minsk would then be ping-ponged on for a third time, this time to private owners, to become the center of a military theme park in Shenzhen, China, the creatively titled Minsk World. This is similar to what happened to her sister ship Kiev, although while Kiev would eventually be refit into a luxury hotel, Minsk was not so lucky. The initial owners went bankrupt in 2006, with the ship and theme park sold to new ownership soon after. Those owners would continue to operate the park until 2016 as visitor numbers gradually declined. There simply wasn't enough revenue to keep the park going, especially because maintaining a ship this size, even stationary, costs a lot of money, as any operator of a museum ship could tell you. So Minsk would be bounced around for a fourth time, ultimately ending up landlocked. There was refit work ongoing to bring the ship back up to standard, with various illegal visitors breaking in. I'll link a video from 2023 in the description. Unfortunately, while under refit in August 2024, the ship caught fire. A fire that completely burnt out the bridge and superstructure, in addition to causing who knows how much structural damage. This was on August 16th, 2024. Exactly what caused the fire isn't clear, but it's put the future of the ship into question. Personally, I fully suspect Minsk is destined for the scrapyard. The damage is incredibly severe and would not be cheap to repair, to put it mildly, in addition to the other issues of deterioration. I could be proven wrong, but it's too early to say. Either way, it's not exactly a glorious end to what was, once upon a time, the pride of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.